Well, good afternoon and welcome to everyone who has joined us here for this webinar today. This webinar is brought to you by the ACT Coercive Control Working Group, which is a consortium made up of members from the Zonta Club of Canberra Breakfast, Soroptimist International in Canberra, the National Council of Women Australia, Canberra as well as the Country Women's Association Canberra, and Rotary in Canberra. So it's a consortium that have been working together initially to uncover, to learn, to research, to work with our ACT government about coercive control legislation here for us in the ACT. And in learning, I've met some new people. I've met Vicky Johnson and Daphne White. And these two women are experts in the field, and they've been working hard and tirelessly. They've been putting themselves out there to help others like us and other women, other men, the communities that they work with, to learn more about what is coercive control about, how can people help themselves, and how could we help others as well. And so I'd like to welcome Vicky Johnson from New South Wales. Good afternoon, Vicky.
Good afternoon, Leanne.
And Daphne White from Western Australia.
Good afternoon. It is still afternoon just here, so thank you for having me.
Yes, we've got you at your lunchtime, and I want to thank you. With us today, you'll also see Sue Latter, who is with Soroptimist International. And we want to thank the Soroptimists for providing this go-to meeting software to allow us to do this smoothly and practicably today and taking all the registrations. So Sue's been very busy helping us. Got dragged into it, didn't you, Sue? But you've been very generous with your time. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of all of the lands, wherever you are today in Australia, meeting and working with us. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, acknowledging ongoing connection to country, to spirituality, and to culture. I would also welcome anyone in the room who is Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander joining us, and also just acknowledge that Australia, we all work hard as a multicultural organisation, as a multicultural country, to acknowledge and integrate many cultures from all around the world. So from whatever culture you come from, welcome into this room today. And so it is with great pleasure that I would like to let the work get underway. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentations. We'll hear from Vicky first and then from Daphne. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat line if you wish, and we'll pick them up and manage them and put them to the ladies at the end of the presentation session. We will close out the session this afternoon with a few final notes, which Sue will organise for us. And so here, as I said, I opened with saying here in the ACT, our government is considering and reviewing potential standalone coercive control legislation, but there are still 5 states in Australia that don't have it. And this is where our working group, our ACT Coercive Control Working Group, learning to work with the ACT government and ourselves about what could happen here, we thought this might be of interest across Australia and help some other places where the legislation is fairly new, like New South Wales, and there are other states that don't have it yet. So in that spirit, I would like to hand over now to Vicky Johnson, who's going to introduce and talk to us about the state of coercive control across the country and some of its definitions and what it means for all of us here in Australia. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you for joining us today. Our discussion today will touch on some confronting information and statistics. So I'd just like to encourage everyone to really look after yourselves as you listen to this presentation today. If you feel uncomfortable, it's okay to take a break. Given the prevalence of domestic and family violence, it's very likely that we have survivors present with us today. If you need to speak about how you're feeling after the presentation, please reach out to us and we'll see what support we can either offer you or direct you to. Thank you. I'd just like to repeat that acknowledgement of country and humbly pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all joining this meeting, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons who are joining us today. So what is domestic violence? The action plans of the National Plan note that while there's no single central definition of domestic violence, there is a central element in that domestic violence is a behaviour motivated by gendered drivers of violence that can involve controlling a partner through fear, coercion, intimidation, for example, using behaviour that's violent or threatening. In most cases, the violent behaviour is part of a range of tactics to exercise power and control over women and their children, and can be both criminal and non-criminal. I'm now going to speak about the national principles to address coercive control in family and domestic violence. These national principles respond to growing momentum across Australia and internationally to better recognise and respond to coercive control in intimate partner and other family relationships. The national principles have been developed and endorsed by all Australian governments. So the definition of the national principles says that coercive control is almost always an underpinning dynamic of family and domestic violence. Perpetrators exert power and dominance over victim survivors using patterns of abusive behaviours over time that create fear and deny liberty and autonomy. There are four key principles within the national principles framework, which outline the critical elements which should inform our policies and practices across a few different domains. The first one is shared understanding of the common features of coercive control, and that's foundational to effectively identifying, preventing and responding to domestic and family violence. The second principle is understanding the traumatic and pervasive impacts of coercive control, which Daphne is going to expand on a bit later. Coercive control has traumatic and pervasive immediate and long-term impacts on victim survivors, their families and communities. And a common understanding of these impacts is really important to across the domains of prevention, early intervention, response, and recovery and healing. The third principle speaks about taking an intersectional approach to us understanding the features and impacts of domestic and family violence and coercive control. So an intersectional approach recognises these differences and the role of multiple and compounding forms of structural discrimination and inequality. And in taking that intersectional approach, we should also recognise the strength and resilience of diverse communities and identities. Principle 4 is about improving societal understanding of coercive control. Having that improved understanding around community attitudes and behaviours, that condone, minimise or excuse coercive control is really important, because otherwise it can limit the effectiveness of interventions, impact how victim survivors recognise and understand their experience, and compromise their safety. So improving societal understanding is critical to addressing this issue. Now, some common features of coercive control are listed here in this slide, and this is directly from the national principles. So if anyone's interested, they can Google the national principles and read this in much more detail than I'm presenting here. So the first common feature is that it can involve the use of physical or non-physical abusive behaviours, or a combination. Perpetrators can use different types of abusive behaviours to exert power and dominance. Subtle and insidious behaviours, individually targeted and tailored, often quite tailored to the specific victim survivor. And if they end that relationship and start a new one, they'll often tailor and use different tactics on the next person that they target, depending on what that person's hot buttons might be. So the manipulative and coercive nature of the behaviour is often only visible to the perpetrator and the victim survivor, which can further isolate that victim survivor, because those things are not necessarily apparent to observers. Behaviours can escalate, or they may use different behaviours all of a sudden, before, during and after the relationship or separation. Perpetrators can exploit victim survivors during life events such as pregnancy or after the birth of a child. That's very, very common. They're high-risk times. And perpetrators can misuse or manipulate services, systems and processes, such as the family law system, the child support system, a range of social service systems. And we call that systems abuse. They also exploit technology to facilitate their abuse. Now, the statistic that I show on this slide and the next slide is from the New South Wales Coercive Control Monitoring Report, published in June 2025. And this stat says that 94% of victims were female. So some other features of coercive control include that coercive control is often practiced in a very methodical and a deliberate way, and it's absolutely a gendered issue. Perpetrators can exert their power and dominance in current and former intimate partner relationships, and also in broader family relationships. Gendered and intersectional power imbalances create and reinforce structural discrimination and inequalities. And the statistic we have here is about the types of relationships that people were experiencing coercive control within. So while coercive control is experienced across a range of relationships, it's important to note that it really is a very gendered issue, particularly in relation to fear and entrapment, which are largely absent from a male's experience of coercive control. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a domestic violence specialist, and I've been working with victim survivors and training in the sector for 20 years. But in our advocacy on this important issue, it's really important to gain an understanding of the legislative landscape in relation to coercive control. So let's look at coercive control legislation internationally that's informed the Australian legislation. Several countries in the United Kingdom have introduced new offences to criminalise a course of behaviour involving non-physical abuse or a combination of physical and non-physical abuse. In 2015, in England and Wales, they introduced the offence of controlling or coercive behaviour. In 2018, in Ireland, the offence of coercive control was introduced. In 2018, in Scotland, the offence of abusive behaviour was introduced. And the slide talks about some behaviours that are encompassed by that definition of abusive behaviour. Now let's compare this to Australian legislation. Sorry, I'm tripping over my tongue today. Now, as was stated in the introduction, there's a different landscape, quite a varied landscape of coercive control legislation across Australia. There are states with standalone coercive control offences, which include New South Wales. They passed legislation in 2022, which came into force last year, and that's currently under review again as was part of the agreement when the legislation was introduced. In New South Wales, the legislation carries a maximum penalty of 7 years imprisonment, and the laws initially apply only to intimate relationships. In Queensland, the laws were passed in 2024 and came into effect in May 2025. Maximum penalty is 14 years imprisonment, and these laws also criminalise using third parties to intimidate a victim with a specific provision for older people, which is lacking in the New South Wales legislation. In South Australia, the legislation was passed in September 2025. They make it a criminal offence to control or dominate a partner through a pattern of behaviour intended to cause harm, and behaviours that restrict an individual's ability to make decisions about their body, work or social life, which is an enhancement of the other legislation. Now, states without a standalone coercive control offence include, first of all, the ACT, Northern Territory and Victoria. They address coercive control within existing family violence laws, but there's no specific criminal offence for coercive control at the moment. Tasmania has criminalised certain behaviours associated with coercive control through the Family Violence Act, such as economic and emotional abuse, but again, they don't have a standalone offence for coercive control. And in Western Australia, they're taking a phased approach, first implementing reforms like education and training for police before introducing a standalone criminal offence. My understanding is that the ACT has made a commitment to criminalise coercive control by 2026, which is part of the reason we're here today. Now, these next two slides give a comparison between the Australian legislation and the Scottish legislation, which a lot of the Australian legislation was based on. Individual states, as we said, have enacted standalone offences, leading to varied legal landscapes across the country, whereas in Scotland they've had a united national framework introduced. The scope of relationships, as we've just indicated, varies across states in Australia. Scotland specifically applies to current and former intimate partners. There's differences in the protections for children, and there's differences in the evidentiary requirements. Now, there's a couple of points I want to just bring your attention to, particularly if you're looking at advocating around this, is the scope of relationships is very important, as having a narrow definition such as intimate partner can exclude other people in relationships which would normally be covered by a definition around domestic and family violence. And that restricts them from accessing the protections of the legislation, for example, abuse of older persons. And the other really important point to note is that the challenges in gathering relevant and adequate evidence and presenting it to police in a manner that they deem substantial enough to work with presents a significant barrier in the implementation of this legislation. Just some further differences we have here are around the criminal justice processes. They're evolving in Australia and include training initiatives, and in Scotland that's quite well developed because their legislation's been around for a while longer. Intent to cause harm is another really significant point, which is the standard for proving psychological harms, and it varies. Queensland law includes an objective test. Scotland's legislation looks at whether it was intended or was reckless in terms of causing physical or psychological harm. And the review of the New South Wales legislation is going to look at that term of recklessness. And there's differences, as we've mentioned, about maximum penalties. That issue of proving intent is a significant challenge to pursuing prosecution under this legislation, which is why in New South Wales they're looking at introducing recklessness as an alternative. And that's the end of my part of the presentation. I'm sorry if it was a little bit dense, but often legal and legislative issues are a bit dense. But as I said, I'm not a lawyer, and I hope that that information has been helpful.
Look, thank you very much, Vicky. If I may just check with you, you've raised this last couple of little points around, as you say, legislation can be tricky. The legislation drafting is quite often very specific. They narrow the scope, they target the scope, and at the same time, they want to also have something that's enforceable, something
Yes.
that they can manage the compliance and the enforcement of. And so where they can put a definition in would be helpful. And I appreciate what you're saying is that they're looking in the review to add recklessness into that intention, adding it with the intention. Do you think that's one of the reasons why in New South Wales they've only had one prosecution so far under this legislation? Why they've been investigating cases, but they've not really brought much through the courts and been successful with it?
I think the two barriers to successful prosecution have been around the evidentiary requirements and proving intent, but also it's a very steep learning curve for our police and judicial system. Police are used to working on an incident-based process, and coercive control is very much about gathering evidence around a pattern of behaviour. So a lot of our work is teaching women how to keep a journal to evidence those patterns of behaviour, and often those journals in New South Wales Police have created an app called Empower You, which has a journal or diary facility on it, and it's that keeping the record of the chronological record of the incidents and things that happen through the relationship that helps build that evidence base around the pattern of behaviour, and also then some of that can lead to proving intent, but certainly that pattern of behaviour would provide evidence of recklessness in the future. But I think, yeah, largely it's those two blockages or barriers, but also the steep learning curve that police and the judiciary are on, trying to get their heads around this offence and how to implement the legislation. It's a very steep learning curve for them.
Oh, very much so, and it could be resource heavy for them when they're under multiple pressures around multiple pieces of legislation. And so, look, Vicky, thank you so much for setting out the scene nationally and showing what's happening in each of the states and giving us some of those legal fine point definitions that help us to understand and to see where our opportunities and our leverage may lie, and how we can help others who perhaps work with us in our community groups to understand what might be happening in our own state. So I'd like to swap over and introduce you all to Daphne White, who is from Western Australia. And Daphne, for us, we discovered your beautiful website, Daphne, that is very practical, very supportive, and helps people, again, to understand what's happening. But Daphne's going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas behind her website in helping women, helping general community people to understand what could be done, how we can work well together, and in helping to bring coercive control a little bit more under control if possible. So let me please introduce Daphne White. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you for having me as well. Yeah, I'm here way out west, and thank you, Vicky, for your presentation. We've got a lot going on here around family and domestic violence reform, but late last year we did have our terminology changed in our Restraining Orders Act, which was a big thing, and to include that pattern of controlling and coercive behaviours. So that really helps victim survivors, in our state get that restraining order when it's needed. So that was one small step, but we've got a lot of work here to do in Western Australia for us to get to where we need to be to, start talking about a standalone offence. What I'm talking about today is a little bit different to what Vicky presented. I'm really talking more about the dynamics, looking at coercive control very quickly on some patterns, and then I'm also looking around the victim survivor experience and looking at the impacts, because that's very important. Understanding all that, because that will help you with your focus for your legislating and your advocacy that you're doing. Okay, so I'll just start also with an acknowledgement. I'm coming from the Southern Yamajis people here in the Midwest of WA. I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us on this webinar and recognise their enduring connection to land, waters, culture and community. Vicky did touch on a little bit about our justice system, and that we're actually built on a system that looks at single incidents. But what coercive control is a pattern of behaviours. So it might start out as something very small and not even noticeable, and it grows and escalates into a really controlling and the acts, the behaviours, the tactics are so controlling that the victim survivor, usually a woman, is completely entrapped, loss of autonomy and loss of choices in her life. Back in the 70s and 80s, when the refugee movement was around, that's what we built it on, single incidents. The power and control wheel came out then as well. And then obviously our police system and our other systems have followed suit even today. If police get a call out, they'll go to, a house and, speak to them individually, and there will usually be a primary aggressor and there'll be someone in need of protection. But it's usually an incident that's happening, just one thing that's happening. And what we want to do is change that to understand that it's not an incident, it's a pattern of behaviours that's important. So I just shared this very quickly, this definition by Professor Heather Douglas, that coercive control is typically a course of conduct made up of series of incremental incidents where a single act may appear trivial, but together they form a broader pattern of abusive behaviours that serve to reinforce and strengthen the control and dominance of one person over another over time. So it just explains it very, very clearly, the way it escalates, and it's cumulative as well. And again, so we've got the pattern, which we're talking is coercive control. This is the ongoing behaviours. And we always have to look at the goal and the purpose of coercive control as well. And it really is about creating fear so that that person becomes dependent, loses their autonomy and their self-worth, so that they don't actually have a life. Professor Evan Stark often calls it entrapment, and I think I heard Vicky use that word as well. And it's a very good word to describe what happens or what the goal of coercive control is. This pattern or coercive control is high risk. So even when there's no physical violence, it's really high risk, and we'll look at that in a minute. The incident-based system is still what we've got. We focus on the single event. We more focus on the black eye, the physical incident. Doing this, we miss that cumulative harm. And what actually happens, we respond too late with escalating risk. And with high risk clients, we actually miss that if we aren't actually mapping that pattern of behaviour. So the take home here is that that pattern-based lens is so important for safe and effective responses. No, there's no hierarchy of behaviour types, and this is also in the national principles as well that Vicky was talking about as well. It's important to understand that all coercive control is serious. So all coercive controlling behaviours, acts, tactics are all individual, they're different. Every experience of the victim survivor is unique. So there's never anything that looks the same, I have found. It's all serious, so we have to really look at it and understand what the risk is around those behaviours that the perpetrator is using. So there's usually physical and non-physical tactics. I find often it's non-physical tactics that start, and usually some physical comes in at the end, or there may be no non-physical at all. And we do know that the case of Hannah Clark and her children, there was no physical violence at all before her homicide. So the impact comes from the pattern, not the method. So it's that ongoing pattern that builds up, and that pattern is there for the perpetrator to control the victim survivor. So when something happens and he loses control, that's when things escalate. So it's looking at that pattern. Invisible behaviours can be just as dangerous. So there's a lot of things that go on which a lot of people still do not recognise, and even working with frontline workers, they don't recognise it either. So for example, they might be saying things like, oh, you don't need to see your friends, you don't need to see your parents. So that subtle isolation, or it could be, moving house, or trying to sabotage their career or their work, or even stopping them from going to TAFE. So those sorts of things might not be visible, but they're actually part of those tactics. Focusing only on physical violence does miss those highest risk cases. So just be aware of that. Take home is every form of coercive control matters, and all deserve that same level of concern as well. So just bear that in mind. I won't touch too much on impacts, because I think we all know the impacts are just, there's just so many. I couldn't name them all here, but we're looking at the physical impacts. We're looking at the psychological and emotional impacts as well from coercive control, spiritual, cultural, social, and I've also included isolation in there as well, and financial. I won't mention them today, but we can share these slides and you can read these later. So there's a lot of things that the impacts are quite chronic, and sometimes I hear from victim survivors, they're saying, oh, Daphne, I wish you'd hit me. It's much better than this psychological, gaslighting that I'm dealing with. So the psychological stuff is so damaging. It is so insidious in the way it's done. Obviously, I've talked about those impacts, but the impact that we really need to, why we're trying to legislate this and why we work in this way, in this industry, this sector, is to try and work out how can we prevent these homicides. So coercive control is absolutely linked to intimate partner homicide. And there have been some studies, in particular the New South Wales DV Death Review team found that 97% of intimate partner homicides in New South Wales, it was preceded by some form of emotional or psychological abuse by that perpetrator towards the victim. So it's definitely there, and that's why I say we've got to consider it is very serious, all cases. Just quickly with the context, I won't talk about intimate partners because Vicky did, but most of the research around coercive control has been on intimate partners. And again, like Vicky said, it's gendered. It's usually predominantly men using coercive control against women, but not in every case. But it is significant in the statistics. Children and young people are also impacted by coercive control. And Emma Katz is a leading researcher in the UK, and she's done a lot of research on coercive control children and young people. And she talks about how they directly are impacted and indirectly impacted. And her research is really, really good to read as well. But kids are the ones that we kind of don't talk about as much, but we really should, because they're right in the middle of the tactics, the acts and the behaviours that that perpetrator is using. And the other one is, has been mentioned, which is great, I did hear around that legislation, is older people and intergenerational. So there's a lot happening with older people within that family network, and it's around financial abuse, that coercive control. It might be control of medication or choices and other things as well. So that's another one which we don't talk about enough. We focus very much on the intimate partner stuff. Just got 4 pieces just to quickly go through if you're advocating or thinking. These, I just want you to maybe consider these. And the first one is around misidentification. And this can be very damaging for victim survivors. And I have worked with a lot of women who have been misidentified, and it's just so hard for them to get back on track when that has happened. The current incident-based response makes it hard to identify coercive patterns. So quite often police go in, they just see that incident. They don't see that pattern of behaviour that's happened before they've turned up. Quite often victim survivors are wrongly labelled as perpetrators. And there is higher risk for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and called women. And I have actually seen this when it looks like mutual violence, or there's both violence happening, and they mutualise it rather than looking at who's got the power imbalance, and they don't have the history. So it's higher risk for those 2 cohorts. Also, self-protective strategies are often misinterpreted as aggression. So victim survivors or women use all sorts of strategies to stay safe, keep themselves safe while they're still residing with the perpetrator. And sometimes, when police are called out, these are misinterpreted as aggression when actually they're protecting themselves or they're protecting their children. So misidentification can lead, and it does, I've worked with victim survivors, to reduce safety, because the restraining order is then, slapped on the victim survivor, and we know that he's the person using violence. And it's also around that increased systems harm as well. So it's important to consider how this will impact those cohorts and the victim survivors in your region where you are considering legislation. So that's the first one, misidentification. The other one is perpetrator engagement. So many perpetrators using coercive control aren't linked into services, or they're not in the service system at all. And Dr. Hayley Boxall has done some good research on perpetrators. She actually lives in the ACT, so maybe you should get her to talk on her study. And her study showed that 30% of these perpetrators using coercive control were middle-class men with businesses. They weren't linked in with any service system, and they evade systems basically. So there's no way we can actually, they're the people that will never be seen, visible, they're the invisible people. There's limited self-recognition of abusive behaviour as well. So if you're a perpetrator, you're not going to say, hey, I'm perpetrating, I need help, because they have too much to lose. They lose the control. So it's very hard around getting perpetrator engagement that is voluntary. Invisible, like I said before, perpetrators, they're not caught by criminalisation, so it keeps going on and going on. And they look on the outside, they're good people in community, but behind closed doors, they're quite abusive. There's low help seeking, minimisation and denial are common. I have worked with men. The first thing they do is deny. The second thing they do is minimise. Third thing they do is blame. So it's really hard, for them to get engaged if they have that sort of attitude. And that's very common with nearly all the perpetrators I have worked with. And I believe legislation alone won't reach everyone we need to, won't reach all those users of coercive control. So just bear that in mind as well. System readiness, like we don't have legislation in Western Australia, but just some thoughts that came to my mind. So our current systems are not yet designed to identify coercive patterns. We do have risk assessments, and there's some things in there when that client comes, but like we do need ideas like the app and other ways of really mapping what's going on for that client so that there is that evidence. The workforce confidence in coercive control identification is also low. I found that because I work across a very large state, and it varies wherever I go. The evidence collection tools don't capture cumulative harm. Some do, some don't. Some are super, cover some bits, but you've got to put your professional judgment in there. Risk assessments often miss those non-physical tactics, and poor readiness is another thing, which I think did happen a little bit in the UK. So that is risk of ineffective or unsafe implementation if you haven't got it all sorted and ready. And that's kind of why I think Western Australia is waiting. They've kind of seen that's happened. And they don't want to jump in until they're completely ready, which is good to hear. And then the last thing is intersection of First Nations voices. We do know, and I think this was also in the national principles, that coercive control is compounded by racism, colonisation and systemic equality. We do know they're higher risk for First Nations, culturally and linguistically diverse people, LGBTIQIA+, and disability as well. And also there's also barriers and challenges for those cohorts to actually get access to services as well. There's research gaps around coercive control. Most of it's done, I think there's just been a little bit done in Australia around intimate partner violence. Not much has gone into those groups at this stage. Just bearing us in Western Australia, we've got such diversity over here. And responses must be culturally safe and community-led. And what I mean by this is most people know their community and know what works best for them. So sometimes one size that fit doesn't work. So just bear that in mind as well. Just where to from here? What do we need for safe and effective reform? I'll just give you some recommendations. So I just gave you 6. As I said, that pattern-based lens across all responses is so critical. Centre victim survivor safety in every decision as well, and that's about involving that victim survivor as well. And I think you do have some victim survivor input into the advocacy you're doing, I have heard. The victim survivor is the expert in her own situation, and especially around her safety. Build system capability before and alongside legislation, so make sure there's the education out there. Ensure culturally safe intersectional responses, so just remember those cohorts I mentioned. Workforce and community education, I can't say it's just got to be done first. And strengthen early prevention to reduce the conditions that enable coercive control as well. So they're just 6 takeaways for you to think about. So legislation does matter, but only when implemented safely, thoughtfully, and with lived experience at the centre. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Daphne, for bringing your perspective and the work that you've been doing in this space into the webinar today. And I'd like to also welcome Vicky back to the panel. And you're getting a few hand claps coming in there, Daphne, down the bottom there. You might see those reactions happening and coming along. And I'd like to invite the audience, if anyone might have a question for Daphne or Vicky, that we could, they've come here primed, ready to go. We don't know what might emerge, but we'll give it our best shot whilst we're here. I might start off with a quick question for you. What do you think is kind of if we've got a lot of people who aren't quite clear on what coercive control is, not just the police or the courts, but also out in the community, having family members or friends of people being able to recognise the patterns when they see it, what do you think is some of the steps that could be taken as a community to help raise awareness, to help raise information and knowledge and understanding to be able to respond more positively and more proactively in a way that brings safety into our communities. What are some of your thoughts about our starting points in our local communities?
Do you want to start?
Okay, I can. Sure. So certainly in New South Wales, they've created a section of a website. The Department of Communities and Justice has a dedicated portion of their website that's dedicated to coercive control, and it has videos explaining different aspects of coercive control in several languages on that website, and a lot of resources available there. So certainly I would see that as a really good starting point. If people were curious, they could go to, anyone can access the New South Wales website and avail yourself of the information. They've worked very hard, and there's a lot of really good information on there. And there's also a website that is WA based actually, and I've done a bit of work for them. It's called Your Toolkit. Excuse me. And on that website, there's actually a coercive control quiz that you can do. And that they've had quite a number of people using that, and apparently that's been quite effective, and it's very user friendly, and they're building that website to go national. I worked with them to develop a service directory for New South Wales. Excuse me, sorry. The current service directory on the website is only for Western Australia, but it's going national.
Thanks, Vicky. What are some of your thoughts, Daphne, about building community knowledge and awareness and education?
Yeah, it's a bit more challenging. Like Western Australia government does have the same resources. I think we've got ours out last year as well, with videos and different things like that. But just where I work across the state, coercive control isn't a word that First Nations understand. So I think we need to go back to more basics, and it's about understanding it is power and control. It's about equality in relationships. It's about respect. So for me, it's about that core stuff of preventing it. Understanding coercive control is great for response and for, you know, if we're going to go down to legislation, but moving it backwards to the first, when we're talking about prevention, it's about respect and equality, because it's not equality when someone's controlling you and trying to make you fearful and that sort of thing. So, and that's where it all comes back in. So I think it's about, early primary prevention, early intervention. It's across the spectrum. You need everything really. Whereas I think recognising it is great at the end, but stopping it is also important. So calling it out right, you know, when you do see that disrespect before it builds into something further. So lots of local resources and ideas, I think, are needed for, not one sort of size fits all, like I said, but if, you know, people have their own, you know, funds or initiatives in their own regions, then I think that would work as well.
Yeah, and there are a lot of activities going on at the moment. I'm sorry. There are a lot of activities going on at the moment around and about with the 16 days of activism that we're presently going through. In our area, we've got a couple of community bystander forums. So there's certainly that early intervention, trying to engage the community in general and get everybody thinking about respectful relationships so people can get on board those activities as well in their local areas, as Daphne said.
Thank you, Vicky. Whilst Vicky gave us, you gave me a little prompt on a silver platter, Vicky, so I'm going to take advantage of it. The ACT Coercive Control Community Working Group, this is one of our core focus points. And so we're talking in the new year about, you know, so what can bystanders do? What could me as a friend do? And looking into having some more practical education around those sorts of topics to help people in Canberra when you're dealing with your family member or you know a friend who might be suffering. I do have a question that's coming from the audience. Laura would like to know, would it help to study other documented DV to have a better understanding of coercive control? And I'm assuming she's talking a bit there about pattern recognition and and also to understand how it might be picked up earlier by perhaps police or by where people are, you know, the situation. What I'm thinking of, Daphne, is what you mentioned around Hannah, that there had been multiple reports made and the police didn't pick up the pattern. And that's what I'm thinking perhaps might be behind Laura's question here. What are some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's important that we do pick up patterns of behaviour and to help, you know, risk. But let's just remember the person using the violence is responsible for that use of violence. So a lot gets, yeah, we've got to be careful. You know, we do the best we do. The police do the best. We're not responsible for his use of violence. He is. But saying that, going back to that, the patterns are different, but Vicky did present on the principles. So there's a lot in there around the different behaviour. I think there's 16 different behaviour types in there, Vicky, from memory. You can have a look at that. I know Dr. Hayley Boxall's done some work on coercive control as well. And there's another document, I just can't think what it is. It might be victim survivor lived experience. Research that's come out as well, which is a national study, so you could have a look at that. But yeah, it's a bit hard. I do have early warning signs on my coercive control online toolkit, and that's about recognizing, you know, the love bombing. Let's move in together quickly. What else was there? You know, you don't need your friends anymore. Doing what she wants to do. All those, you know, sort of controlling things that happen very early on, which is classic signs of coercive control. But again, it's not in every case.
Yeah, nice. Thank you, Daphne. Vicky, would you like to add anything there?
Just one other little thing. I think Daphne's done a fabulous job giving us that overview. One tool that we use with a lot of clients is the power and control wheel, and also the equality wheel. And they're very accessible. They're very simple tools. They're quite visual tools, just one page each of them. So if we have a client coming in and she says, oh, I've just got some relationship issues, I just need help to manage relationship issues, we bring out the equality wheel and we say, well, is this what your relationship looks like? And after doing a bit of work with her, when she really can't see much of her relationship in that wheel, we'll bring out the power and control wheel, which really describes the tactics that perpetrators use. And the power and control wheel is a very good illustration of the different tactics that are involved in coercive control, really. So those are very simple tools that anyone can access. They're very easy to use and to understand yourself, or when trying to explain this or get someone to recognise some red flags in their relationships.
That's powerful. Thank you. Thank you, Vicky. Very interesting. Look, whilst I'm here, I just want to acknowledge that we're coming to our time boundary that we advertised for today, and I have the world's longest for you. We've got one here. Philippa would like to know, what are the best advocacy targets, say, in South Australia? If we wanted to be sure that our response system is ready, both for workers and the police, or should it be earlier than that, perhaps about having an available app? So this is about what could be a really reasonable, feasible advocacy action or target that we could put out. And she's suggesting, you know, do we need to do something about apps or links, quick connections that women could use? Or is there something about our response system? Would you have any thoughts
Which
about
one of
that?
us did you?
Vicky, would you like to have
okay.
Yeah.
I always worry about apps. There are a number of apps that are available now, but the problem with apps is that perpetrators often have access to and control of her devices. So if he sees an app on her phone that he doesn't recognise, that could raise a risk a red flag for her with him, and that could actually lead to an escalation in the violence. Some apps are clever, like there was an app called Daisy, and maybe he might think that's a period tracker or something and not show much interest in that, but I would worry about an app called Empower You, because he doesn't want her empowered. He wants her very much under his control. So, but having said that, apps are quite accessible. Some of them disguise themselves with, when you open on the front page, it might come up to something like a yoga class schedule or something like that, and then you have to dig a bit deeper to get to the domestic violence component. But there's a lot of things like that still in development. I haven't seen anything that I think meets my standards of safety, but they are easily accessible. People do use a lot of apps. But then there are things like the coercive control quiz on the your toolkit website that's quite easily accessible. And a lot of the websites have quick exit buttons on them too. So if she used it in an incognito window and used the quick exit facility, that could be a safer option. Yeah, so my initial comments.
Thanks, Vicky. If I may, Daphne, this might connect to another question that's come in, because Lynette's asked a very similar question, that if the phone isn't great, you know, Vicky's just talked about how sometimes the phone can be problematic in these situations, or the phone could be taken by the perpetrator. He could be constantly confiscating that phone. So what other means are available for survivors, for people stuck in this situation? What other means could they use outside of the phone?
Okay, so most perpetrators smash the phones. They don't take them, well, from my experience. And we do have women come in always for safe phones. But what we try and encourage victim survivors is, like, we should not give up our technology. We just need to use it safer. And quite often we have women coming back in for phones, and people say, oh, they're coming in for more phones. I said, you've got to understand it from the victim survivor's point of view. He's doing that purposely as part of this ongoing pattern. So phones are very important, so is technology. So we say don't cut them off. It's about being smarter. I think if you want to advocate for something, advocate for better support for people to manage their technology to be safe. I know we've got the E-Safety Commissioner, but maybe we need specialised advocates that do that, because I know I'm not great with IT, but it is one thing that is used very, very highly across all coercive control patterns. And there was a lady that did do her own website, and she was a victim survivor, because when she left, he tracked her, and then she was actually staying safely with someone who was an IT guru, and he helped her fix everything. So she put that in action. I can't remember, it's called Alt-Delete something, Alt-Delete Safety or something. But that's the sort of thing I think is needed. And also, you know, understanding that pattern, like I said, that pattern of abuse across all responses as well is important. So yeah, I'm not sure about apps either. I know they've trialled a few in remote regions and they don't really work unless you're using them.
Interesting to see. We've got to open the door and generate lots of different options and lots of different pathways to suit people and their different needs, and what's available to them in different communities and in the different patterns of behaviour that they're experiencing. So look, I'm aware that we're reaching a time boundary, and we do want to, if people are able to stay just for a moment at the end as we do a final wrap up together. But we do have a very quick question that's for you, Vicky, and it's about getting some more information about those wheels, those power wheels that you've been talking about. Where can we find that information?
The wheels were developed by the Duluth Project in Minnesota in the United States. That's spelled D-U-L-U-T-H. So if you just Google Duluth wheels, you will be led to a website full of them. They've got many, many more that have been developed since the 70s, as Daphne referred to, when the women's movement was starting out. That's when the wheels were being created, and they've added quite significantly to the library since then.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Vicky. Look, I want to encourage everyone who's watched this seminar today to think about where in your local community are some activities. We are in process now with the 16 days of gender activism linked to the UN International Elimination of Violence Against Women program. And you'll find all kinds of different activities going on in your local community. And for those of us who are in service clubs, we're probably running some of them, like this webinar today. And I'd like to encourage each of you to reach out and look for more information, to perhaps, you know, contact Daphne or Vicky, go and look at their websites online, and go and look at those other websites. Like Vicky mentioned, the New South Wales government website is quite expansive, and educate ourselves, because that's part of spreading the word across the community. Look, I've been Leanne Elliott, I still am Leanne Elliott from the Zonta Club of Canberra Breakfast, on behalf of Zonta Club of Canberra Breakfast, the Soroptimist International in Canberra, the National Council of Women of Australia in Canberra, the Country Women's Association here in Canberra, and of course Rotary as well in Canberra. I'd like to introduce and hand you over to Sue Larter from the Soroptimists, who's just going to take a few final moments to wrap up for the afternoon. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, what an afternoon. Thank you, Leanne, for facilitating the afternoon. Daphne and Vicky, thank you very much for attending and presenting today. It's all right, I'm just trying to find someone that needs to come in as well to do that, and I don't know whether I did. So when the ladies were talking about 16 days of activism, I'd just like very, very quickly to show you two things. First off, it is to thank, it's all right, always happens when you try and talk and present at the same time. With the 16 days of activism, it runs from the 25th of November through to the 10th of December. Just again, the supporters we couldn't have done without Zonta. Thank you, Leanne. NCW, ACT, as well as NCW Australia, Country Women's Association, Rotary, and of course, Soroptimist.
Oh, Sue, have you frozen? Have we lost Sue? Because here in Canberra, if you come down to Nara Park on Lake Burley Griffin, it's pretty early in the morning on the 10th of December to close out the 16 days of activism. We will be ringing the Nara Peace Bell in jointly with Rotary. We ring it once per time to recognise the loss of every woman's life in Australia over the past year from domestic violence. And we'd like to recognise, you know, this understanding that we're coming to realise that coercive control, as you said, your statistics show it, 97% of the violence cases, coercive control was a lead into it. And so that's one activity that you could come to if you're in Canberra. Come and join us on the 10th down at Nara Park. I fear we have lost Sue and the Soroptimists. Will she return? I'd like to thank everyone who came today, who made the time available in our busy lives, especially as it's coming up to Christmas. I hope you all have a safe and productive summer, that you and your friends support each other and help each other to have productive, resourceful, behaviours amongst you and your friends and your family, that you help teach the young people in our communities about productive and helpful behaviours. And I'd like to ask you to join in thanking Daphne and Vicky for making their time available today to help. You know, I've learned some quite more new details, some little fine points of distinction there. And I'm sure there's been plenty of people in the room who've also learned. You're getting a slew, I'm sure you can see them as well, a slew of clappings and hearts coming up the screen. And thank you so much for showing your appreciation for the work, the ongoing day-to-day, daily work that Vicky and Daphne are doing to help people across Australia, so we have a more successful community and improve the quality of life for all Australians. Thank you.
Thank you. And can I just get one plug in, seeing you mentioned a 16 days event? Next Saturday morning at Randwick, I'm co-facilitating a bystander forum to teach community members how to be active bystanders in their local communities. You'll find it advertised on Randwick Council's website, or just contact me if you want the registration details. But I warmly welcome everybody to join us for that if you're in the vicinity of Sydney. And we have the wonderful youth advocate Daniel Principe co-facilitating with us, and he's a very engaging speaker. So we're very excited to be able to present that event next Saturday.
Oh, how that's exactly the kind of thing I think the community needs. Well, that's what we're talking about. It's like, we might need, where are my Canberra ladies? We might need to check this out, Canberra ladies, and see what we can do in Canberra. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming today. And we have recorded this session today, and it will be distributed via the organisational networks, and potentially we will be trying to put it up online so that we can then send you a link and you can share it with other people in your clubs or in your local communities who weren't able to attend today. Oh, Sue, you come back to us at the last minute.
I do apologise, ladies. I don't know. My computer kicked me off, so I'm on the phone. Please, everybody, there are 2 handouts. If you haven't already downloaded them, please do that before you go. All of the websites and things that Vicky was talking about are on there, as well as a document from Julianne is being put there, as well as some Queensland things for you.
Thank you for that prompt. Lovely. Thank you, and go well, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.